Good afternoon. I'm Jackie Vossler. It gives me great privilege to be able to introduce this co-hosted program. It's always my privilege to be able to work with our friends at the Union League Club Library. Some 8 months ago, we were going to host this very program on Chicago apartments in this very room. It is our great honor to be able to do that today. It also reminds all that the Caxton Club and the Union League Club Library continue to look for that moment in time when we can again intersect. From a distance of 6 feet, I can see clearly that we will be again intertwined. And now it is my privilege to introduce my co-host, Cheryl Ziegler from the Union League Club Library, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Jackie. On behalf of the ULCC Library Committee and Literary Subcommittee, I'm honored to introduce our speaker for tonight. Neil Harris is the Preston and Sterling Morton Professor Emeritus of History and Art History at the University of Chicago, where he taught for 39 years. Mr. Harris has published widely on a variety of subjects: The Artist in American Society, Humbug, The Art of P.T. Barnum, Cultural Excursions, Building Lives, and The Chicagoan are among his books. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a former holder of a Guggenheim Fellowship, and a Getty Scholar, and he has served on a series of institutional boards and committees. Of course, he is also the author, with the assistance of Terry Edelstein, of Chicago Apartments, A Century and Beyond of Lakefront Luxury. It's my honor to present Neil Harris.
I want to thank Cheryl and Jackie for their introductions. I want also to thank the Caxton Club, the Union League Club, and the Chicago Art Deco Society for being interested enough to invite me to give this presentation. I'm here to talk about the book that my wife, Terry Edelstein, and I have just done, Chicago Apartments, A Century and Beyond of Lakefront Luxury, issued by the University of Chicago Press this spring, maturing in a warehouse for some months, but finally released. Almost 20 years ago, a New York publisher approached me with a question. He had just done a lavish book on the legendary apartment house architect, Rosario Candela. Candela's buildings remain among Manhattan's most luxurious apartments today. The publisher wondered whether Chicago contained any comparable such buildings. I took this as a challenge, and that basically was the origin of Chicago Apartments. Partnering with my wife, Terry Edelstein, who did the hard work, was a labor of love, combining photographs, renderings, and plans for many ambitious apartment buildings. 99 in the first edition was exciting. Helped by friends in the archives of the Chicago History Museum and the Art Institute of Chicago, plus the remarkable photographs owned by Dave Phillips, we moved ahead. We thank them all and the various foundations that supported the publication. As an academic writer, my readership could often fit comfortably within an average living room and sometimes within a small living room. But this book was different. The audience was large and enthusiastic. We enjoyed hearing their memories, building residents, relatives of residents, realtors, amateur historians, and all sorts of unexpected devotees surfaced, many of us contacting us and looking for copies of the book. And so within 4 years, by 2008, a remarkable run, or at least a considerable run, was exhausted. The book went out of print. Reprinting would be expensive, but so were used copies. So it seemed like a good idea to bring out another edition. I could correct some errors. More than that, we could acknowledge some changes in living style. The Driehaus and Terra Foundations and BMO Harris agreed to help. Luxury, it turns out, is not static. Definitions and desires evolve. It was worth taking another look, and that's what Terry and I have done. We kept the book's black and white format to preserve its unity and history, and I'll be showing you mainly black and white photographs that are in the book with a few unexpected additions, and retain emphasis on the opulent high-rises of the 1920s, which again are the core of the book. But we move beyond them, as you'll see, to much later times. By the 1920s, apartment houses had only recently become respectable and legitimate. Respectable family life, according to many, was possible only in houses. Sharing walls was fine, but sharing entrances was not. Flat life, so popular in Europe, was tarred by association with tenements. Even worse was hotel living, suggesting low morals, ostentation, and indifference to privacy. Ironically, in Illinois, again a glimpse of Chicago's townhouses from the late 19th century, in Illinois, ironically, the only way to incorporate an apartment house project and incorporate it was to call it a hotel. The Illinois legislature, attacking land speculation after the Great Chicago Fire, forbade incorporation to buy and improve land. A hotel corporation, though, was legal. So apartment houses could be built only by individuals or partnerships. Thus, the oldest apartment building in our book, and the only one without an elevator, is the Hotel St. Benedict Flats on East Chicago Avenue, put up in the 1880s by an Irish immigrant. Actually, the Hotel St. Benedict resembles a string of townhouses when you face it from across the street. Its elaborate ornamental details, still worth looking at today, surround a series of separate entries. The illusion of separation remains. But by this time, tastes were already changing. The reforms of Baron Haussmann had made Paris into a city of apartment houses, controlled by uniform height and festooned with lively facades, many of them facing the Grand Boulevard. Since Paris, as someone remarked in the late 19th century, was where good Americans go after they die, these 6- and 7-story piles began to exert greater appeal. And in fact, some early apartments, as many of you know, were called French flats to acknowledge their inspiration. Americans, however, made one major addition: the elevator. Visitors to Paris today know to their discomfort those oddly shaped and tiny moving cylinders retrofitted into French stairwells. They are called ascenseurs, elevators, but next to the often elegant staircases, they look like a desperate afterthought. Guests with luggage continue to find them a particular challenge. Here, in this country, elevators tended to be inserted in anything higher than 5 or 6 stories. Chicagoans dislike climbing stairs, and spacious, paneled, attended elevator cabs would soon be a feature of the grander buildings. The elevator was important for another reason. It increased social segregation. The uppermost floors of Paris apartments, you see here following the arrow, were lived in proverbially by starving artists, the poor were servants who trudged the stairs to rooftop garrets. The most desirable apartments, with their high ceilings and their spacious rooms occupied the lower floors. So no one could, in fact, American elevators changed this because they meant that the upper floors, if anything, were more valuable than the lower. One could reside in a grand building then only if one could afford the high charges. The clientele was largely homogeneous by race, religion, and class in the grander buildings. Manhattan, with somewhat constricted land availability, led Chicago in the late 19th century with imposing and even huge apartment buildings. Some are legendary today. Most of you, I suspect, have heard of the Dakota, built in the 1880s, still a grand building on Central Park West, but there were many others from slightly later, like the Navarro Flats on Central Park South, the 2,500 room Ansonia on Broadway, or the Doralton Apartments, which again you see here in this image. The Chicago apartment houses of this era were relatively smaller and more restrained. 1210 North Astor, for example, or 2800 North Pine Grove of 1893, the Brewster, or 2344 Lincoln Park West, or the apartment buildings that you see here, spacious, substantial, comfortable, and here is the Brewster by Enoch Hill Chernak. These were, however, not overpowering. Just before World War I, however, change came. And a set of buildings by one local architect were significant because of their height, their location, and above all, their luxury. The supreme master of the grand hotel and apartment houses of this era was Benjamin Marshall. Marshall has recently, within the last 10 or 15 years, enjoyed revived interest and new scholarship, inspiring enthusiasts who have created a society to honor him, as well as a recent biography. Marshall led a flamboyant personal life. He built notable hotels like the Drake, the Edgewater Beach, and the Blackstone, along with his apartments. He selected prominent sites on or near the lakeshore. The two pioneers were 999 North Lakeshore Drive, and that's the building here, and 199 East Lakeshore Drive on the right. These are shown in lonely splendor just before World War I. They contained large, high-ceilinged apartments, many with multiple fireplaces, grand views, and of course, numerous rooms. 199 itself was built in two parts. The annex, which you see here to the right, the upper floor of the annex, was added to the building just 4 years after the early part was completed. Both of these were speculations put up by investors to be rented out at impressive levels. Just to the north, about the same time, Marshall completed another, even more significant apartment building at 1515 North State. This building was important for several reasons. First of all, its 12 stories stretched the upper limit for flat buildings of this type. Second, its lavish full floor apartments, 8,000 square feet, set a new standard for spatial generosity. The public rooms, which you see here, stretched some 100 feet across. The floor plan, of course, is in French, denoting an especially impressive building. The servants' quarters included their own dining hall. Third, the impressive rentals achieved, somewhere between $8,000 and $9,000 annually in 1912. In today's terms, that might translate to somewhere between $160,000 and $200,000 a year, $15,000 a month. Soon after the building opened, its tenants, fearing even heftier rent increases, banded together and bought the building from Benjamin Marshall, who needed cash for his Edgewater Beach development on North Sheridan Road. This was not Chicago's first cooperative, but certainly was its most prominent. By the time America entered World War I, Chicago contained many luxurious flat buildings, most on the north side, but several like this one, 5490 South Shore Drive, the Jackson Shore Apartments on the south side. This building was designed by George and Cornelius Rapp, who were the architects of several important downtown movie palaces, in fact. 5490 is also interesting because its selling brochure has survived, and selling brochures were crucial in the creation of this book. Their survival allowed us to see what those who built them intended. The text and the pictures suggest the appeals that luxury buildings held for prospective tenants, and these included extensive services, proximity to the lakefront, again, sweeping views, and handsome layouts. The brochures themselves, gathered together in the 20s and 30s by an architect, a Chicago architect, hundreds of them, are housed at the Ryerson Library at the Art Institute. Some of them are superb pieces of printing design. At 12 stories, 5490 was about as high as Marshall's 1550 North State, but with 2 apartments to a floor, just a bit less spacious, but nonetheless extremely spacious by our standards. The same year that 5490 was completed, 1917, 2 Chicago realtors, A.J. Partridge and Harold Bradley, published a guide to Chicago luxury apartments, entitled, candidly, A Directory to Apartments of the Better Class. Its floor plans and photographs are a mine of information, but only 18 of the 68 buildings in the book contain more than 6 floors, and none went beyond 12. Still, some of these apartments had their own wine closets, silver safes, and large quantities of marble and mahogany. And the building on the left is included, in fact, in the new edition of Chicago Apartments. Just 11 years later, in 1928, Beard and Warner, the realtors, published their own guide demonstrating that a real revolution had taken place. A portfolio of fine apartment homes is a testament to this construction era. 19 by 12 inches in size, elegantly designed, embossed, and its binding, as you can see, beautifully printed, and today rarely available. Even the end papers, as you can see, were spectacular. Dozens of its entries, most of them high-rises from the mid-1920s, found their way into Chicago apartments. Why so many in just 6 or 7 years? And there are a series of reasons that I will go over very briefly. First of all, prime sites had suddenly become available for development. Investors like the Potter Palmer and Edith Rockefeller McCormick interests were seeking better returns on capital. Mansions dating back to the late 19th century came on the market, and some major estates were broken up. Rising land values made it attractive for these homeowners or their heirs to start unloading their properties to syndicates. Second, transportation and park improvements, notably extension of the Lakeshore Drive, which was extended both south and north, ultimately beyond 67th Street and north with the expansion of Lincoln Park. These reduced travel times and offered park front aprons to many of the new buildings. Third, and here you can see three images of Lakeshore Drive, separated really by fewer than 20 years, but you can see how remarkable in 2 decades the development of the buildings on East Lakeshore Drive actually was. Third, there was Chicago's first zoning ordinance, which raised height restrictions on office and residential buildings alike. Fourth, technological innovations and building code changes, which increased the efficiency of construction. Fifth, an increase in the cost of living after World War I, which, when combined with immigration restriction, created a domestic service crisis for the upper middle class. This made apartment house and residential hotel life more appealing. And finally, a new form of financing, which, with state legislation, allowed the cooperative apartment building to flourish, both in 100% and in partial forms. Most of the 20s buildings in the book were cooperatives, often financed by bank-issued bonds, usually bearing a picture of the proposed building and its specification. And these bonds were another real source of information. Sold one by one, the buyers purchased shares of the equity and a percentage of the large mortgages owed to the financing bank. Taxes and building expenses would be met by assessments. Described in great detail as a form of the cooperative developers promised that building materials and amenities would be of high quality, as they were intended for owner occupants rather than for renters. The cooperatives hugged the lake from South Shore to Edgewater, many of them designed by a particularly prolific architect, Robert DeGolyer. DeGolyer had worked in Benjamin Marshall's office and is the best represented architect in the book, responsible for some 13 buildings. It was DeGolyer who broke the mold on the north side in 1925 when he completed 1120 North Lakeshore Drive. At 18 stories, it eclipsed the 10 and 12 Benjamin Marshall buildings, which were nearby. Its shape reflected Chicago's new zoning law, and in early photographs, it really looks like a giant among pygmies. Dressed in Gothic details, a favorite stylistic choice for DeGolyer, the apartments began around $12,000 to purchase. And in today's terms, something on the order of $250,000. It also contained a garage, like some other recent buildings did. DeGolyer soon exceeded this height when he designed a 25-story building a few blocks north, 1430 Lakeshore Drive. It was only 45 feet wide, and another of his exercises in Tudor Gothic. It was originally planned for one apartment to a floor. Unfortunately, the developer, W.C. Bannerman, who had worked with DeGolyer on many apartment projects, turned out to be a crook. He created dummy corporations, inflated costs, received kickbacks, and stole shares. And even before the Great Crash, Bannerman was declared insolvent, and angry shareholders sued. But the well-planned building survived that, and it survived intact, as does the building just to its south, 1420 Lakeshore Drive, and that's the building shown here in this architectural sketch done for the Chicago Tribune. The weekend editions of the Tribune featured architectural sketches of buildings that had not yet been completed, but were in process of development. DeGolyer also built several structures on the south side. And here you can see the first of them, 5000 East End, which was the tallest building south of the Loop until really after World War II. It opened as the first of 5 East Hyde Park high-rises on the former grounds of the Chicago Beach Hotel in the late 1920s. The Chicago Beach essentially sold its riparian rights, the rights to the land bordering the lakefront, and after landfill, a whole new area was created. 5,000 in Tudor Gothic was something of standard architectural issue by this time, but another DeGolyer building just half a block away was very different. This time, DeGolyer was the architect, but Charles Morgan, a modernist and a noted draftsman who had done many of the architectural sketches for the Chicago Tribune, was the person who made a difference. And Charles Morgan was the associate architect for both of these apartment buildings, which of course still stand today, the Powhatan and the Narragansett. Because the modernism that Morgan favored was evidenced in these buildings, they produced rather interesting and innovative facades, of which the Powhatan was perhaps the most colorful, a Deco-inspired, reinforced concrete structure that incorporated a Parisian aesthetic descended from the 1925 Exposition, but inflected with American Indian themes. With many features like a rooftop ballroom and an indoor swimming pool with richly paneled wood and aluminum elevator cabs, the Powhatan was likened to an ocean liner. Morgan designed the details and the building's clean modern lines, which some saw as influenced by Elio Saarinen's famous second place entry in the Chicago Tribune competition, which had taken place a few years earlier. DeGolyer, who is an experienced planner, did the interior layouts. Meanwhile, the parade of great buildings along East and North Lakeshore Drive and on Lakeview continued. One of the most ambitious came with the 1929 completion of 1500 Lakeshore Drive, which required destruction of the mansion of Victor Lawson, the publisher of the Chicago Daily News. The architects of record here were McNally and Quinn, but there was a hefty New York influence on 1500, particularly the planning assistance of Rosario Candela, who I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. Many 1500 owners brought in their own architects to design their residences. These owners included William Wrigley Jr. and banker George Woodruff, who occupied an 18-room bungalow, it was called, that continues to sit atop the building. Photographed by Hedrick Blessing, this was one of the city's most lavish interiors. Its baronial style featured paneling, a great hall, and highly distinctive his and her bathrooms. One of them, the one you see here, finished in Renaissance style. This was Mrs. Woodruff's bathroom, and you can see it in a recent photograph retaining some of its features. Mr. Woodruff's bathroom was done in what was called Pompeian, the original bathroom, and the present bathroom as they look today. With drone photography, which wasn't available when the building went up, one can see this extraordinary bungalow on the top of 1500 with the beautiful garden, looking out on Lake Michigan and projecting a strong Mediterranean flavor. Banker Woodruff's fortunes did not survive the crash, and he had to sell this spectacular bungalow, supposedly for a song. But unlike many cooperatives, 1500 escaped insolvency and remained, as it does today, a cooperative. Now, the Woodruff interiors are one of many we could document through period photographs. And one of the things that Chicago Apartments tries to do is to recover what these apartments looked like when their original owners lived in them. reflecting their taste and the work of an earlier generation of interior designers. On the south side, Jackson Towers, which faces today's Museum of Science and Industry and was designed by Walter Allschlager, sported elaborate duplex apartments stepping out of 16th century Spain, or even better, 20th century Hollywood. Huge fireplaces, scattered coats of arms, stuccoed walls, all made the point of spectacle. Meanwhile, on the north side, on streets just west of the drive, like Cedar, Walton, and Delaware, other impressive structures appeared. 20 East Cedar is distinctive partly because of its two-story duplexes. Its construction actually bankrupted its developer, Harold Bradley, who is the co-author of that early apartment house guide that I just mentioned. Another building, 900 North Michigan, which no longer survives, contained on its lower floors fabulous interiors created for the likes of Cyrus McCormick, who was one of its developers. State and Astor Streets hosted smaller versions, 1260 and 1301 Astor, both limestone-clad modern buildings by Philip Mayer, contained simplex and duplex flats, and in the case of 1301, a triplex, which belonged to the Potter Palmers. These apartments attracted the attention of some of the city's most prominent interior architect designers. Here you see the decorator Elsie Cobb Wilson at work in the Robert Hall McCormick apartment. Francis Elkins, David Adler, Paul Schweiker, and architect Philip Mayer also indulged their tastes. And a number of these apartments, of course, were modern in keeping with sophisticated taste in the late 20s. Robert Allerton, Frederick Clay Bartlett, and the architect John Wellborn Root Jr. lived here. And as I say, several of the residents had a taste for the modern, or at least their designers did, expressed in some remarkable rooms. Further north, the sale of large estates and the demolition of family mansions meant development opportunities. 399 West Fullerton was one of several large apartment buildings put up on what had been the Nellie Loeb estate. Nellie Loeb was a member of the Bush family of St. Louis, the great brewers, and in fact, there were quite a number of brewers living in this neighborhood. Peter Reynolds, the developer of 1500 Lakeshore Drive, had a hand in this 16-story building, which claimed in its brochure to be available, and I quote, only to families of recognized social and financial standing. It stood just to the south of three luxury buildings on Lakeview, which were erected at about the same time. 2430, which you see here by Andrew Rabori, 2440, and 2450. 2430 is almost entirely duplex, and many of the residents favored Georgian details. These were 14-room apartments, which soon housed prominent families, including those of its architect, Andrew Rabori, and the Goodspeeds, Charles and Bobbsey. And you can see Mrs. Goodspeed here in her apartment above a portrait of herself. The Goodspeeds, among other things, hosted part of Gertrude Stein's visit to Chicago in the 1930s. David Adler designed their apartment and provided extraordinary detailing. Each duplex included a graceful staircase connecting the two floors. Just to the north is 2440, begun the year after 2430 had been completed. A partial co-op, and this was a form favored by a number of buildings, many of the 107 units served as rentals to support building costs. This co-op collapsed basically as a co-op during the Great Depression, but was reborn in 1950 as many of its rental tenants bought apartments. Just to its north was 2450, designed a few years earlier by Howard Van Doren Shaw. Shaw had planned 1130 Lakeshore Drive, but he moved here for his last years. And here, seen from his own apartment, at least 4 Art Institute trustees lived at 2450 in the 1920s, among them Charles Hutchinson and Kate Buckingham, who incorporated part of her father's Prairie Avenue home within her apartment itself. Another view of an apartment here belonging to the famous cartoonist John McCutcheon. These 5-bedroom full-floor units rival in size the East Lakeshore Drive buildings. More grand apartments from the 20s can be found moving northward along Lakeshore Drive, some of them, as at 3750 and 3800, towering structures with gables, chimneys, oriels, and in the case of 3750, another DeGolyer building, an indoor swimming pool, as the Powhatan has. These, along with many others that I have to admit, of course, are described and illustrated in the book, and here was the original brochure for 3800. And so we moved northward until its northern border, the Edgewater Beach at 5555 North Sheridan, and here is the apartment building itself, which was, of course, part of a recreational complex at this point. It's 3 buildings offering tourists and conventioneers all the pleasures of a summer resort: golf, tennis, big band dances, just 15 minutes from downtown. And here you can see a drawing, a rendering of the apartment building itself. It was the final piece of this compound, cleverly arranged by architect Benjamin Marshall to cut down the length of hall corridors and maximize light and air for the 16 apartments that were planned on each floor. There were 300 apartments in all, and the Edgewater Beach still contains its own shops, swimming pool, and exercise rooms. Here I have to end the 1920s survey, reminding you that many of the buildings I have just described went up in a rather frenzied 5 or 6 year period. They epitomized the interwar ideal of luxury: lavish and often uniformed support staff, large rooms, many rooms, formal dining rooms, high ceilings, butlers' pantries, libraries, cedar closets, servants' quarters, commodious kitchens, customized interiors with tradition-laden details inside and outside, panel lobbies opening up to their guests, separate passenger and service elevators, social homogeneity, and ethnic and religious restrictions. They contained apartments of approximately the same size range, emphasized privacy, and wherever possible offered lake views. Dramatic staircases for the duplexes added to the allure. This was luxury as the city's elite and privileged upper and upper middle classes defined it. The Great Depression, of course, brought all this to a sudden and seemingly irrevocable halt. What followed was the Great Hiatus. For 25 years, luxury building, including, in fact, most tall buildings, went into almost total eclipse from 1930 really through the 50s. Architects like DeGolyer sought work from the federal government. He, in fact, helped plan the Pentagon. Others designed federal housing projects. I show you 2 photographs of Chicago, a decade apart, to indicate Chicago's static skyline in those years, its unchanging appearance. Developers turned to other things. All of this, the pre-1930 city, but still in the 1940s, much the same. The building developers turned to other things. Buildings went bankrupt, unable to pay off their bonds. Speculative investors took over much that remained. Recovery begins in the 50s and 60s. One early entry in our book was the promontory on the south side, middle class and patronage, but at 22 stories with lake views and modern conveniences, a Mies van der Rohe cooperative at affordable prices. Soon after the promontory came the Mies glass houses on the north side, iconic and hugely influential, modern inside and out. Outer Drive East and Marina City were not far behind. These buildings, familiar, I think, to many of you, are described in the book, as is the Carlisle, an early entry in the luxury category at 1040 North Lakeshore Drive. And as the 70s began, Lake Point Tower and the John Hancock became available. Much larger than their 20s counterparts, both in floors and number of units. They were increasingly condominiums. The Illinois Condominium Act had been passed in 1966, and they really replaced almost entirely the cooperatives. The floor plans of these buildings tended to be more constricted in room size, number, and ceiling height. And I show you just a few examples here are reproduced in the book. A few buildings, notably Lake Point Tower, exploited building technology to offer expansive spaces, but more typically time rather than space had become the crucial commodity, meaning efficiency of maintenance and self-sustaining amenities for exercising, for shopping, cleaning services, parking, temperature control. These were now major elements of a luxurious apartment lifestyle. Luxury meant efficiency as well as display, and stylistically was favored by post-war modernism, minimalist in character, and decoratively restrained. Servants' rooms waned along with servants. Microwaves, frozen foods, delivered foods, fast foods, these shrank the kitchens. Butler's pantries vanished, as did silver storage, fur vaults, crystal and china cabinets, beam ceilings, and fireplaces. All these were replaced by other things, large windows, compact kitchens, central air, and bigger clothing closets. These trends were documented in our 2004 book, but not long after that, luxury building was interrupted again. The Great Recession of 2008-9 sunk many schemes and soured banks on condominium financing. Some feared a catastrophe in building that approached the Depression. But in fact, Chicago recovery, now with rentals, came much quicker than expected. And with it, large, self-contained complexes boasting elaborate amenities. Parts of Chicago over the next decade blossomed with projects, some of them far from the lakefront. In fact, others battening off of new downtown attractions like Millennium Park, when Lakeviews themselves were continued to be popular, but the river, enhanced and alive day and night with the River Walk, became a particular asset. All of this seemed to us worth noticing and saying something about. So the new edition has 14 new entries, most of them completed within the last 5 or 10 years, as well as a couple that were somehow missed the first time around. We added some period photographs, we commissioned some new ones, and in one case, we actually included a building that was never built. And I start there, the only building in the book never constructed. It climaxed many trends of the previous decades and also foretold what would happen in the years immediately following. And this was Santiago Calatrava's much loved or much hated Chicago Spire, designed and redesigned in the heady years between 2005 and 2007, just before the crash. Many may remember the elaborate promotional campaigns, the amazing floor of model apartments in the NBC building that marketed the new structure to prospective renters and to prospective buyers, actually. They may also remember the elegantly printed brochure. The Spire stood on the cusp of two eras of merchandising. One of the last buildings to commission truly elegant printed literature. Even the end papers were spectacular. The developer, Garrett Kelleher, and the architect, Calatrava, had extraordinary ambitions. The engineering itself was astonishing, and sales offices opened in 14 cities, Dublin, Moscow, Seoul, Hong Kong, among them. This was just when Chicago anticipated landing those Olympic Games that ultimately went with mixed results to Rio de Janeiro. The brochure describes the city as the world's 19th largest economy. It claimed 4 states could be visible from the higher floors, almost 1,200 apartments in the 150 stories, and the 7-sided building would have a 15,000 square foot lobby, 52 feet high, 17 elevators, storage for 400 bicycles, a teen interactive center, private movie theater, boardroom with video conferencing, massage rooms, lap pool, rock climbing, saunas, library, cafe. The amenity list went on. And of course, it promised to regenerate to Sobel Park. Perhaps best of all were Calatrava's ingenious interior spaces, ranging from 534 square foot studios to a 10,000 square foot penthouse, and that's the plan that I'm showing you here. This was actually sold for $40 million, but the smaller apartments truly amazed visitors. I remember being one of them. Hidden hardware turned these tiny studios into surprisingly spacious living areas. And here I can show you an interior, not of a studio, but of a smaller apartment. The structure, in short, was transformational in scale and detail, in its enormous range of apartment sizes, its variety of spaces, its surrounding park, its amenities, its international clientele. It anticipated many buildings that followed. You all know the sad end. 30% of the apartments were actually sold, but the crash melted the financing. And despite several recent proposals, the foundation hole remains a hole, although there is some promise of new building. The 12 years following brought other grand structures, several of them included in this new edition. To start, Jeannie Gang's influential Aqua, whose dynamic sculptural facade made a huge impression here and really around the world. Completed about the time of the financial collapse, after some delays, it mingled a hotel, rentals, and condominiums, a blend other buildings would maintain. And this photograph, which appears on the dust wrapper of the book, is, of course, of the Aqua. The Aqua, at 82 stories, was one of the tallest of this new generation, but it has to give way to the considerably higher Vista Towers, which is being completed this year. And we had to use an architectural sketch because the building wasn't completed at the time the book was being printed. Rather different in plan and outline, Vista also contains the characteristic features of the contemporary super tall apartment residence. That is, a surrounding park, a vast array of amenities, a broad range of apartment sizes. Like Aqua, it has a strong sculptural presence, its flowing curves challenging the more angular geometry of most of its predecessors. And like Aqua, it privileges river views along with the lake and the city. Big, but not quite as big as Aqua or Vista, is the Legacy, which exploits the completed vision of Millennium Park, which it faces. Its connection with the University Club, which you see here just to its left, along with its Jewelers Row profile on Wabash to the west, connects three eras of Chicago architecture: modernism, neo-Gothic, and 19th century Chicago commercialism. Here you see the view from the west. They make for a rather remarkable summary of the city's built landscape over a century and a half. Other new buildings invoke the 1920s standouts that I was talking about earlier. Some revel in older touches, like Lucien Lagrange's mansarded 2550 Lakeview, one more of the French-inspired structures that he has created in Chicago. 2550 abuts on an easily accessible chapel, which honors Mother Cabrini, whose hospital once stood on this site. And it features an elaborate garden designed by the New York landscaper Thomas Balsey. The garden is another popular trope of these grand new buildings, also exemplified by the Van Valkenburg Park attached to One Bennett Park's Grand Avenue mix of condominiums and rentals. And you see here again a sketch of 451 East Grand. New boutique structures in more contemporary style capture the scale and economic homogeneity of the older buildings. Thus, the book includes Larry Booth's 30 West Oak, along with some of its elegant contemporary interiors. Art collections play a significant role in them. A few blocks south is the even newer 9 Walton, also by present standards, a rather small building. Both demonstrate the continuing appeal of this near north area, despite the extended geographical spread of apartment building life to the west and south. But in their size, they are definitely outnumbered by colossal counterparts like Raphael Vignoli's Anima on Roosevelt Road, again, a string of tall buildings, the counterpart to the buildings to their north on Randolph. These buildings are quite remarkable in their own way. In fact, the Vignoli building the Anima claims to be the tallest rental building in the city. And with its neighbors to the east, they define a giant C made up of Roosevelt Road, Michigan Avenue, and the buildings that parallel Randolph, with, of course, Millennium Park at the northern end. A giant stage set, which again shift attention a bit away from the limitless horizon of Lake Michigan. And here you can see a closer view of Vignoli's Nima. Luxury is power, power is control. They are expressed symbolically as well as practically. And I conclude with the dramatic shift in bathrooms. These 1920s buildings expressed their luxury in opulent, colorful details like the Woodruff extravaganzas which I showed earlier. These bathrooms featured an elaborate historicism and eclecticism. Today, a stark simplicity has replaced many of them, along with the crucial addition of stunning views. Both are exemplified in this penthouse bathroom, perched high in the Legacy, just next to its own sauna. Bathing with the city surrounding you, separated by just a thin wall of glass, securely hidden, yet dramatically exposed. Two versions of luxury, each reflecting distinct conceptions of privilege, power, and comfort. I stop here. What Chicago's luxury housing will look like in another 16 years, in 2036, if someone creates a third edition of this book, is anyone's guess. Will luxury apartments become even smaller? Will buildings become even taller? Will computers and robots further transform daily life? Will new parts of the city be colonized for them? Will they still create their own private parks? Will condominiums disappear? No one knows, but views, opulence, and unexpected amenities will all probably be part of their future development. Thanks very much.
We have a first question is from Kevin Davis, and he says that he's doing a research on Chauncey and Brooks McCormick. I know Chauncey lived downtown circa 1920s and 1930s to 1940s in an apartment building. He was the president of the Art Institute. Did you run across anything on Chauncey?
He was at 2450 North Lakeview, which was the home of so many of the Art Institute's trustees. But beyond that, I think we didn't do any further investigation into Chauncey.
No, it's Cyrus McCormick, I was remembering, was at 900 North Michigan, and his apartment is pictured in the book. The inside of his apartment
But
is
not-
pictured in the book.
Not Chauncey.
But not Chauncey's, no.
All right, thank you. Thanks.
We have a question from Chris G. How do you think the recent unrest and concern for safety will affect the market for existing condos and the building of new condo buildings? How long for recovery?
Well, fortunately, I'm not in the development business, so I don't think I have to make any precise predictions. I really don't have any idea. Events change with such speed these days that it's like taking a snapshot. I don't know in the end whether it makes sense to talk about long-term trends based on a few months of activity. I don't know, Terry may have some thoughts.
I really don't have anything to answer. The only thing we can be sure of is that we can't be sure.
Were you aware that the top few floors of 1420 North Lakeshore Drive have never been finished?
Many apartments, since the first edition of this book has come out, a number of buildings have been pursuing their own history. In the case of the Powhatan, we did studies through the 1930 and 40 census reports to see who lived in them. There's a great deal more to know about the social history of each of these buildings. I'm afraid I can't add anything more to why those. I see that we say that it was planned for a top floor duplex with open terraces. At least that's what the Chicago Tribune commentator Philip Hampson wrote. That it wasn't finished, I presume, was a function of the fact that it may never have been sold. But I don't have any specific information about that duplex.
Thank you. From Cheryl Ziegler, you indicated that the Spire site may be revived. Do you have any details on that?
Nothing more than I get from the newspapers. I know there was a plan for 2 buildings to be constructed on the site. There was some opposition about dealing with density and height, which, of course, is a recurring theme these days in Chicago. I'm not sure what the latest information is about the site. There still are hopes to create at least one tall building on that site. But as far as I know, the details have not been finalized.
Unlikely to be as tall as the spire was projected to be,
Cer-
obviously.
Certainly not as tall, not 150 stories by any means.
In the book, do you feature the Art Deco building, the Metropolitan Tower at 310 South Michigan?
We do not feature that building, which wasn't built as an apartment building. I think
That's a conversion.
and on the whole, we did a few conversions, the American Furniture Mart, for example. But we did not, on the whole, do conversions. We were interested in emphasizing the purpose-built apartment buildings.
And I believe, I might be incorrect, that conversion was completed after the first edition was finished, and with the space that we had available to us in the new edition, apart from adding two older buildings that we felt their style and architects had been unrepresented, we really concentrated. There was such a huge amount of new construction that had gone on since the last book was completed that we really concentrated on that, because with the room we had, with new buildings, we were able to include only a small number of the new buildings that had been added since the first edition.
Carl Condit once remarked that a building at about 1400 North Lakeshore Drive was the first in the 1920s to permit a Jewish person to buy or occupy. Can you comment on the role of restrictive covenants in the development of these luxury apartments?
Most of those luxury co-ops were restricted, as far at least the East Lakeshore Drive and North Lakeshore Drive. Now, the building that Carl Condit was referring to might have been 1540, which is a building just to the north of 1500. Those restrictions lasted really through the post-war era in a number of cases.
You might want to mention your census research on the Powhatan.
Yes, and some buildings changed very dramatically during the Depression itself, as we found when we looked at the census reports of 1930 and 1940. But restriction, this was the point I was really trying to make about the elevator, that the elevators made these buildings more restricted than many of their European counterparts, by making every floor, if you will, equally accessible, and the higher floors, which without an elevator were less desirable in Paris, became even more desirable here. So restriction was a key part. Some of the language was coded, some of it was not, but it was a clear part of the social evolution of these buildings. And there were exceptions, and I think Carl Condit, again, may have been referring to 1540.
And when all of you, of course, who have the book will read every word cover to cover. And when you do that, you will find that in some of the entries, I can't now dredge up exactly which buildings, but in a few of the entries, there's language is quoted from the building announcement or from the building brochure, which says that the building is going to include people only of the highest caliber. Those are the kinds of coded words that Neil was referring to, which indicate that it's only going to be people of your own class that are going to live there. Of course, in the case of certain buildings, I'm thinking of 1301 and 1260 North Astor, a group of people came together and bought every apartment in that building before it was built. It was purchased, the building was funded and constructed by a group of people who knew one another. So in that case, they were absolutely certain that only people they knew and liked were going to be in those buildings. The census that Neil was referring to, he did research in the 1930 census for our own building, the Powhatan, in which you could see that the building was then restricted by religion. by the 1940 census for our own building, that had completely disappeared. There were certainly substantial numbers of people who were Jewish who were living in the building by 1940.
Fern Allison is asking, why is the Edgewater Beach pink and why is it kept pink?
Well, I don't live in the Edgewater Beach, so I can't tell you why it's kept pink. I have no specific information there, except that it was a part of the exuberance, perhaps, of this recreational complex that existed in its immediate vicinity. And I can't speak to why Benjamin Marshall chose pink, but it certainly creates a statement that's rather distinctive. Some resident of the Edgewater Beach may have to speak to this.
Well, I think that's the last of the questions we have on the chat. If anyone has any other questions, feel free to ask. If not, then I'm just going to assume this is it. I'm going to thank Neil for joining us and for answering all these questions. I would like to thank Jackie Vossler and Cheryl Ziegler for organizing all of this. And with that, I'm going to let Cheryl make any closing remarks. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Zarko.
Thank you for
Thanks, Zarko.
doing all the recording, Zarko.
Right. I do also want to thank you, Neil and Terry, for a fantastic presentation. And thank you to all Caxton Club and Union League Club members for attending. On behalf of the ULCC Library Committee and Literary Subcommittee, we are all so very grateful for our special partnership with the Caxton Club and look forward to many, many, many more collaborative programs in the future.
Thank you for attending this program this afternoon. It has been our great privilege to co-host. And until we can meet in person, we will see you in Zoom.